Hello, everybody. Welcome to Storytime again from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today is about an old woman named Birdie and the Brindlebeast. Once, not so very long ago, there was an old woman named Birdie. Now, Birdie lived all alone in a little house out by the edge of the village. And, she needed something to do to earn money for food and for fixing her roof, which was leaking a little bit in the corner, and for, everything, clothing and all of those things. And so Birdie went to find what she could do. And the only thing she could really do, because she was pretty old, and so she really couldn't work in the farm fields, and she really couldn't climb up and fix roofs, and she really didn't have the energy anymore to work in the village inn. So what she would do is she would go to the different houses of the women who lived in the village, and she would help them with their chores. She would help them with the cleaning, or the baking, or taking care of the children, or helping the children with their homework at the end of the night. And she would do whatever she could. And at the end of the day, all of the women of the village would send Birdie home with a little bit of cheese and a little bit of bread for her supper. But they always made sure that Birdie left with enough time to get home before it got dark. For you see, this particular area of the world was troubled by a thing that they called the Brindlebeast. Some people said it was a giant of an animal with long ears and sharp teeth and a long tail and strong feet. And others said that it was something that wasn't quite that big, but it had a forked tail that would stab you with, and hoofs on his feet, and short little ears, but teeth that would bite your throat out if you got caught out after dark. Well, nobody really seemed to know exactly what the Brindlebeast looked like, but everybody agreed that the Brindlebeast was terrifying. It was not something you wanted to see, and it only came out after dark. And so the women of the village always made sure that Birdie had enough time to get home before the Brindlebeast might be about. Well, this particular night, it just happened to be All Hallows Eve, or as we call it here in the United States a lot, Halloween. Birdie was on her way home, and she was running just a little bit later than usual, so it was already starting to get dark as she went through the village. Well, she got close to the edge of the village, and she could see her house just a little ways down the road, when she spotted something in the middle of the road. And when she walked up to it, she looked at it and she saw that it was a black pot, like some of the women in the village used for cooking in. And she thought, well, I don't need any cooking pots. And it's a very nice looking pot. Probably belongs to someone. But when she looked around, she couldn't see anyone that might be looking for a cooking pot. And so Birdie thought maybe she would take this pot home. She had some lovely blue asters, some flowers that she needed to plant in something, and this would be a very nice pot to plant them in. But before she decided to try to figure out how to take the pot home, she figured out that she should probably look inside of it to see just how heavy it was likely to be. And so Birdie bent down and she picked up the lid of the pot and she looked inside, and oh my goodness, she was so astonished to see that inside the pot was a pile of gold. Well, there really wasn't anyone looking for this, and she thought for sure that someone should be out looking for a pot of gold if it belonged to someone in particular in the village. So Birdie decided that since no one was looking for it, perhaps she could keep some of the money. She could use some of it. Yes, she could. And so she looked at the pot and she thought, well, it's a bit too heavy for me to pick it up and carry it all the way home. But if I take off my shawl, she said to herself, and, Birdie had a habit of talking out loud when she was talking to herself. It's something that happens a lot of times when you live all by your own self. So Birdie took off her shawl and she said, now let me think. If I tie this end around the pot and sort of scooch the pot a little bit so it's on the shawl, there we are, and then tie the end around it, then I can pull it behind me. Yes, I can do this. I can do this. And so she started walking down the road. And while she was walking down the road, pulling that pot along behind her on her shawl, she started thinking of all of the things that she could do with the money that was in that pot. There was things like, well, I could buy a little extra bread and cheese, and then I would have some for the winter. Oh, and I could fix that leak in the corner of the roof. It's not a bad leak. It didn't rain inside when it rained, but there was a little bit of water running down the wall, and that couldn't be very good for the wall. And I could probably share a little bit of it with the people in the village that need it the most. And, well, I could put a little bit by so that on days when I don't get quite enough bread or cheese from the people in the village, I could buy some from the shops. Yes, that would be good. And so while Birdie was walking home, pulling that shawl with the pot full of gold behind her, she got a little tired. She was, after all, thinking very hard and pulling it. I don't know if you've ever tried to lift a pot full of gold, but it's pretty heavy. And so she was pulling it along behind her, and she got a little tired. And so she got about halfway home, and she stopped for a little bit of a breather. And when she turned around and looked at that pot of gold sitting behind her on her shawl, much to her surprise, it was not a pot of gold anymore. It was a small barrel of apples. Well, now that is the strangest thing, Birdie said. I could have sworn that was a pot full of gold. Well, perhaps that was all just a lovely dream. A barrel of apples. Oh, that's very useful too. You know, I could make some pies, and I could save some, and oh yes, definitely. Now this time, Birdie had gotten her breath back. So she picked up the end of her shawl and she began pulling that barrel of apples home with her. And while she was pulling it home, she was thinking what she was going to do with all of those apples. She could make some pies and some tarts. She could give some tarts to the children. Oh, they would love that. And some pies and some cobblers. And she could put some in the cellar so that she would have apples during the long winter to come. That would be lovely. Oh, and what else could she do with them? And she thought of all of the things she could do with those apples. Well, when Birdie got back to her front porch, she got to the front yard of her house, she turned around to pick up that barrel of apples and try to carry it into the house. And much to her surprise, she found that it was no longer a barrel of apples. Now there was a large pumpkin sitting on her shawl. Well, that is the oddest thing, said Birdie. I could have sworn that was a barrel full of apples. But a pumpkin is just as nice. I could use it to make a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween. Oh, that would be lovely. I haven't made a jack-o'-lantern in years. Oh, and then when it's done being a jack-o'-lantern, I can make it into pies. Oh, I could make so many lovely pumpkin pies with that pumpkin. Oh, it's a nice big one. Oh, yes, I like this idea. And so Birdie bent down and she picked up that pumpkin and she took it into the house. And she cut open the top of it. And she lifted it up and she scooped out all of the seeds and the goo from inside. And she cut a funny face in the front of her pumpkin and she put a candle inside. And then she put the lid back on and she took it back outside and she set it on the front stoop of her house and she arranged it very carefully. Well, by this time it was getting quite dark. And so Birdie decided it was time to light the candle inside her fantastic new jack-o'-lantern. And so she went into the house and she got a burning light from the fireplace and she came back out and she lit the candle in the pumpkin and she stood back to see the effect of her beautiful jack-o'-lantern. Well, much to Birdie's surprise, as she stepped back, suddenly the pumpkin began to huff and to puff and spit out smoke and bits of sparks. And suddenly, the flame of the candle inside the jack-o'-lantern shot up so high that it knocked the lid off of the jack-o'-lantern, and it shot up into the air. And Birdie was just standing there. She was very surprised by all of this. And then the jack-o'-lantern began to jump up and down on the step. Boink, 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 boink. And it jumped up and down on the step. And then it rattled around a bit and it fell off the step and it landed in the front yard. And all of a sudden, the pumpkin, which was jumping up and down, began to sprout out legs, and then arms, and then horns, and then ears, and then a tail. And suddenly, it was not a jack-o'-lantern anymore. It was a big, hairy animal with horns and big ears and a long tail and hoofs on the end of its feet. And it stood there and it yelled at the top of its lungs. And Birdie just looked at it. Well, imagine that, she said. Fancy me having the Brindlebeast all to myself and enjoying all of the fun myself, and no one else around to join in the fun. Well, isn't that lovely? Well, the Brindlebeast looked at her and he said, I'm not supposed to be fun. You're supposed to be afraid of me. Everyone's afraid of me. They all run away screaming. And Birdie said, well, I don't see why. Your company on my trip home made the trip home quite interesting. And, well, you're quite amusing, you know, with all that jumping about and spitting of flame. And it was quite amusing. But if you're so very upset that I wasn't afraid of you, I do have a supper of bread and cheese waiting for me in the house, and I should so like to get to it. If you'll pardon me. And Birdie walked up to her front door. When she got to the door of the house, she turned around and she looked because she heard a strange sound behind her that sounded rather like, excuse me. And when Birdie turned around, she did not see a great big beast with long tail and horns and hooves. No, instead she saw a little man, a little bit smaller than normal, but not much. And he looked, well, very ordinary. And Birdie looked at him and she said, oh ho, so the horns and the hooves and the tail and all of that is just flash and fire, I see. Should you care to join me for supper? I have bread and cheese and good water to drink. And I can make some tea. That would be lovely. And the Brindlebeast looked at her and he said, if you don't mind, that does sound rather lovely. I would like some company. And so the Brindlebeast went into the house with Birdie, and they had a lovely tea of toasted cheese and toasted bread and wonderful tea. And the Brindlebeast, well, he never did say where they came from, but Birdie turned to put the tea kettle on the fire, and when she turned back, there was a lovely little dish of boiled eggs on the table, and a lovely little basket full of biscuits, and they had a wonderful tea. And the Brindlebeast told Birdie the most amusing stories of how he had startled so many people, and she laughed so hard she cried. Well, after that day, the wee little man, he came back to visit Birdie quite often, and well, Birdie never really said anything, but the roof in the corner that was leaking, one day she found it had been fixed. And another day, after she had had tea with the Brindlebeast, she found that the wood next to her house that was chopped for the fire, for the fires for during the winter, was stacked all the way up to the roof line, plenty of wood to last her through the winter. And so Birdie found that she had made a friend of the Brindlebeast. Now the people in the village, they were all still quite terrified of the Brindlebeast and told horrible stories about the terrifying creature that they found. And Birdie, well, she never told them any different. Instead, when they would tell the scary stories of the Brindlebeast, she would just smile a secret little smile and think about the wonderful stories she was going to be able to tell her friend, the next time he came for tea. And that is the story of Birdie and the Brindlebeast. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will join us again on Friday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time. We will have another story for you from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. See you later. Bye.